Goblins.
Goblins?
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins!
Goblins.
Goblins?
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins!
Goblins.
Goblins, goblins,
Goblins.
goblins, goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins.
Goblins. Goblins.